No heroes here, life in a Goblin Stronghold. Chapter 1. The Gates of Gritstone Hold. The great wooden gates of Gritstone Hold were neither great nor entirely wooden. Reinforced with salvaged scrap metal and scavenged armour plates, the gates had been patched and repatched so many times that they creaked under their own weight. A particularly strong push might knock them off their hinges, but no one dared to test that theory. Not with Snagg standing guard. Snagg was the self-proclaimed first gatekeeper of Gritstone Hold, defender of the door and supreme inspector of suspicious things. This meant that, most of the time, he stood with a rusted pike in one hand and a half-eaten mushroom pasty in the other, watching the world with narrowed, beady eyes. The morning shift had just begun, and Snagg was already in a bad mood. "Oi, you there!" he barked, pointing his pike at a goblin hauling a suspiciously lumpy sack. "What's in the bag?" Mushrooms," the goblin said, shifting on his feet. Snagg squinted. "Lies. Mushrooms don't wiggle." The sack let out a muffled squeak. Fine, the goblin grumbled. "It's me, pet tunnel weasel. Got her in a bet." Snagg considered this. A tunnel weasel wasn't technically against the rules, and he had been thinking about getting a pet himself. He grunted and waved the goblin through, making a mental note to confiscate the weasel later if it turned out useful. The next traveller was a hobgoblin merchant, pushing a cart piled high with dented helmets, chipped swords and rusty mail. "Name?" Snagg demanded. The hobgoblin sighed. "It's me again, Snagg. Grathok the arms dealer." Snagg squinted at him. "Never heard of you. You say that every time." "Got any weapons for gatekeepers?" Snagg asked, glancing at the cart. "Same deal as always, half price for guards." Snagg nodded, satisfied. "All right, move along." The day dragged on in much the same manner, shady traders, goblins returning from surface raids, and the occasional scavenger dragging in something they claimed was valuable. By midday, Snagg was starting to think about lunch when the gates shook. A heavy thump echoed through the cavern, then another. Then a voice rumbled from the other side. "Open the gates! It's Grob and the boys!" Snagg groaned. Grob's hunting party was back, which meant two things. They were going to make a big fuss about their so-called heroic victories, and whatever they brought back would smell horrible. With a resigned sigh, Snagg signalled to the crank team. The gates groaned open, revealing a group of filthy, grinning goblins carrying a massive, unconscious beast. "Troll!" Grob announced, grinning triumphantly. The other goblins whooped and cheered. Snagg looked at the creature, which was barely breathing. "It ain't dead." Grob scratched his head. "We were hoping the chef could, fix that part." Snagg sighed, pinched the bridge of his nose and waved them in. "Fine. Just don't let it wake up near the mess hall again. Last time was a disaster." As the hunters dragged their oversized prize inside, Snagg leaned against his pike, shaking his head. "One of these days," he muttered to himself, "this stronghold's going to fall apart, and I'll be the only one who saw it coming." If then, deciding he had earned a break, he dug into his pasty, took a bite, and let the chaos continue. Chapter 2. Breakfast in the Underhalls. The mess hall of Gritstone Hold was a cavernous, smoke-filled chamber where the stronghold's goblins gathered to eat, argue, and occasionally throw food at each other. The walls were lined with crude banners made from old cloaks and stolen tapestries, giving the place a half-decorated, half-dingy look. At the far end of the hall, the Goblin Cookmasters' Guild, which consisted of 3 goblins who had declared themselves in charge of food, worked frantically over bubbling pots and sizzling slabs of questionable meat. "Less screaming in the kitchen!" bellowed Cookmaster Scragg as something let out a shriek from inside a cauldron. "Breakfast ain't supposed to fight back!" The kitchen was already in chaos. One goblin chef, Clod, was chasing a grease-covered rat that had escaped from a stew pot, while another Miggs was angrily beating a chunk of meat with a ladle for being too chewy. Meanwhile, the queue for food stretched all the way to the entrance, with hungry goblins grumbling and jostling for position. Snagg, fresh from his gatekeeping duties, elbowed his way to the front. "Guard privilege," he muttered. shoving a scrawnier goblin aside. Scragg slapped a bowl of something thick and lumpy into Snagg's hands. "Eat up. It's the special today." Snagg eyed the stew, watching as it sloshed lazily, resisting movement like it had opinions about being eaten. "What's in it?" he asked. Scragg wiped his hands on his filthy apron. Mushrooms, rat bits, maybe some beetle eggs. Dunno. Grob's boys dragged in a troll last night, so we're saving room for fresh meat." Snagg grunted. He'd eaten worse. He took a seat at a splintered wooden table where a group of goblins were already deep in morning gossip. "You hear about last night?" One goblin, Zibs, was saying. "A few tunnel diggers went too deep and something started knocking back at 'em." "Probably just echoes," another goblin grumbled. "Or maybe one of them deep cave things what eats goblins whole." Zibs leaned in dramatically. "Or maybe it's the ghost of old boss Gruck, back to punish us for eating his stash of pickled toes." The table went silent. Snagg scoffed. "Gruck weren't no ghost. He got eaten by a rockworm and we all know it." "Yeah, but what if the rockworm spit out his bones and now he's mad?" The goblins shivered. Ghosts were much worse than rockworms. At least you could stab a rockworm. Before the conversation could spiral further into paranoia, the kitchen doors banged open and a goblin runner burst into the hall, panting heavily. "Attention, everyone," he wheezed. "The war boss is making an announcement." Groans rippled through the crowd. "Again?" Snagg muttered, shoving another spoonful of stew into his mouth. "He's been ranting a lot lately," Zibs whispered. "You think something bad's happening?" "Bet it's about his missing cricket stash," another goblin snickered. "He's real upset about that." The goblins started to clear out of the mess hall, some dragging their food with them as they made their way to the war boss's platform. Snagg sighed, finished his stew and stood up. Whatever nonsense Cruz was about to yell about, it was bound to be entertaining. Besides, he had a strong feeling that this morning was only going to get weirder. Chapter 3. The Tinkers and the Traps. The war boss's speech had been, predictably, long-winded and mostly about his missing roasted cricket stash. While he had worked himself into a frothing rage over the injustice of food theft, the goblins had nodded along, some pretending to listen, others using the distraction to swipe extra breakfast portions. Now that the morning routine was over, Gritstone Hold returned to its usual chaos. Snagg, relieved of his gatekeeping duties for the afternoon, wandered down to Tinker's Alley, a winding stretch of tunnels packed with goblin inventors, trap-makers and alchemists with more enthusiasm than caution. Here, crude signs marked various workshops, most of them featuring misspelled warnings like "Danger," "No touchy," "Explosions possible," or "If you hear screaming, keep walking." One particular workshop had a lot of screaming. Snagg peered inside to see a goblin dangling upside down from a ceiling trap, thrashing wildly as another goblin scribbled notes. Muttered the note-taking goblin, Gix scratching his chin with an ink-stained claw. "Still too sensitive. This one triggers when a goblin sneezes. Might need more bones in the pressure plate." "You think?" the trapped goblin shrieked. Snagg smirked. "What you working on this time, Gix?" Gix turned his wide, goggle-covered eyes gleaming with excitement. "Ah! Snagg! You're just in time. I've been working on a new trap, one that resets itself. No more digging pits every time some idiot falls in." He gestured wildly to a collection of crude contraptions, bear traps with jagged teeth, swinging spike logs, and something that looked alarmingly like a spring-loaded boot on a tripwire. "Watch this!" Gix declared, pressing a lever. The bear trap snapped shut with a clang, then, with a series of clunky gears grinding, slowly reset itself back into place. Snagg blinked. That's actually kind of clever." "Right? Right?" Gix was practically vibrating with excitement. "Now, imagine if we put this all over the tunnels. No more lazy goblins forgetting to reset traps. No more adventurers sneaking in easy." Snagg rubbed his chin. "Anything bad happen when it don't work right?" "Well," Gix hesitated. "There was an incident yesterday where it wouldn't stop resetting and kept eating the same goblin's foot over and over." Snagg winced. "Who?" Gix waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, he's fine. We gave him a stick to chew on while we got him out. He only bit 3 goblins." Before Snagg could comment, a loud boom shook the tunnels, sending a shower of dust from the ceiling. "Ah, what now?" Snagg muttered. Gix sighed. "That's got to be Fizzbricks." Fizzbricks was Gritstone Hold's resident alchemist, which meant he spent his days mixing volatile chemicals and occasionally not blowing himself up. Snagg and Gix hurried to the next workshop, where the door had been blasted off its hinges. Inside, Fizzbricks, his face blackened with soot, his tattered robe smoking, was giggling like a maniac. "It worked," he coughed, waving a vial of sickly green liquid. "Mostly." Snagg peered inside. The walls were scorched. The floor was covered in melted stone, and a single, very unlucky goblin was wobbling in the corner, his skin flickering between blue and green. "What in the undertunnels is this?" Snagg demanded. Fizzbricks grinned. "A new kind of alchemical flame. Burns just as hot, but the colours change at random. Imagine, a rainbow of destruction." The wobbling goblin groaned, then promptly fell over. "It might still need some work," Fizzbricks admitted. Snagg rubbed his temples. Between Gix's over-enthusiastic traps and Fizzbricks's artistic explosions, it was a miracle the stronghold hadn't collapsed yet. "You two," he said, pointing at them both, "if either of you blows up a tunnel, I ain't cleaning it up." "No promises," Fizzbricks chirped. Gix held up a finger. "Technically, if the tunnel collapses, it means the trap worked on whatever triggered it." Snagg groaned. "Idiots, both of you." Still, despite the sheer recklessness of Tinker's Alley, Snagg had to admit these were the kinds of goblins that kept Gritstone Hold standing. Barely. With another sigh, he turned to leave. If he was lucky, the rest of the day would be somewhat normal. But in a Goblin Stronghold, luck was never something to count on. Chapter 4. The Mushgrove Farmers. Far beneath the noise and chaos of Tinker's Alley, past winding tunnels and crude wooden ladders, lay the Mushgrove, a sprawling cavern where Gritstone Hold's goblins farmed the most vital crop in the stronghold: mushrooms. Unlike the warriors, trapmakers and raiders who thrived on mischief and destruction, the goblins of the Mushgrove were a different breed. They spent their days tending to bioluminescent fungi, underground root vegetables, and the ever-hungry cave pigs. And today they had a problem. Snagg arrived at the Mushgrove after being called down by Boss Grizzle, the head of the farming operation. Grizzle was an older goblin with a dirt-streaked face and a tunic patched together from old potato sacks. Unlike the rowdy goblins above, he had no time for nonsense. "Finally!" Grizzle snapped as Snagg strolled in. "Where've you been? We got a situation." Snagg raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. A mushroom thief?" Grizzle's face twisted. "I wish! We got a beetle stampede!" Snagg's stomach sank. Oh, not again. The giant cave beetles were the stronghold's beasts of burden, slow, sturdy, and useful for carrying heavy loads through tunnels. When calm, they were as docile as oversized snails. But when spooked, stampede. Grizzle led Snagg through the winding rows of mushroom plots, past grazing cave pigs snorting lazily in their pens. Then they reached the problem area. A herd of 6 massive beetles, each the size of a goblin wagon, was rampaging through the fields. Mushrooms were crushed underfoot. Root vegetables were flung into the air. A pair of farmers had taken cover behind a pile of dirt, watching in horror as one particularly large beetle gnawed on the wooden support beams of a storage hut. Snagg whistled. "That's a real mess." "Yeah, no kidding," Grizzle shouted. "Now get in there and fix it." Snagg scratched his chin. How'd they get riled up? A nearby goblin farmer, clutching a pitchfork, piped up. "Some idiot from Tinker's Alley was testing something near the tunnels. Big boom, scared 'em silly." Snagg sighed. "Fizzbricks again?" The farmer nodded. "Figures." Snagg stepped forward, assessing the situation. The beetles weren't angry, just panicked. Their antennae twitched wildly, their stubby legs scrabbling against the stone floor. All right, Snagg muttered, rolling up his sleeves. "I've dealt with beetles before. We just got to calm 'em down." Grizzle crossed his arms. "And how do you plan to do that?" Snagg grinned. "With snacks." He grabbed a nearby bucket of fermented mushroom mash, the strongest-smelling food in the Mushgrove. Even cave pigs turned their noses up at the stuff, but beetles loved it. With a flick of his wrist, Snagg flung a handful of the slop toward the stampeding beetles. One beetle skidded to a halt, its antennae perking up. Another stopped mid-charge, its beady black eyes locking onto the food. Then, in an instant, the rampage turned into a feeding frenzy, but at least they weren't trampling anything anymore. Within minutes, the situation was under control. Goblin farmers rushed forward with more buckets, leading the beetles away from the fields and back toward their designated grazing area. Grizzle wiped his forehead. "All right. Crisis over. I guess you earned a meal for that." Snagg smirked. "I was hoping you'd say that." The farmers led him to a nearby hut where a steaming pot of mushroom stew waited. Snagg took a seat, stretching his legs as the day's chaos finally started to settle. But just as he lifted his spoon, boom! A distant explosion rumbled through the tunnels above. Snagg groaned, rubbing his temples. "You know," he muttered, "sometimes I think this whole stronghold's held together by dumb luck." Grizzle grunted. "Then you better hope we don't run out." With a sigh, Snagg shoveled another spoonful of stew into his mouth. No doubt something was on fire upstairs. But that was a problem for future Snagg. Chapter 5. The Goblin Pit Fights. If there was one place in Gritstone Hold that never ran out of action, it was the fighting pit. A deep, circular cavern carved into the stone where goblins settled disputes, tested their strength, and occasionally just fought for fun. It was loud, rowdy, and completely illegal, which was why the war boss pretended it didn't exist. Snagg had no business being here today. He wasn't a fighter, and he wasn't a gambler. But he had finished his breakfast, helped stop a beetle stampede, and still had hours to kill before his next shift at the gate. So, with nothing better to do, he followed the shouts and jeers toward the pits. The air was thick with torch smoke, sweat, and the overwhelming stench of goblin excitement. A crowd had already gathered around the pit's edge, screaming and waving handfuls of stolen coins and trinkets. Down below, two goblins circled each other, both battered, bloodied, and too stubborn to quit. "Lefty's got him!" someone bellowed. "Nah, he's got no stamina. My money's on Smurg." Snagg squeezed through the crowd and spotted Zibs, the best gambler in the stronghold, sitting on an overturned crate with a pile of shiny objects in front of him. "Snagg, finally got the fighting spirit, eh?" Zibs grinned. "Nah," Snagg muttered. "Just watching." Zibs snorted. "Coward." Down in the pit, Lefty, a wiry goblin missing 3 fingers, swung wildly at Smurg, a stocky brute with a dented helmet but no actual weapon. The two crashed into each other like sacks of potatoes, rolling in the dirt, each trying to bite, claw, or headbutt their way to victory. Smurg managed to get on top, grabbing Lefty's ears and slamming his head into the ground. The crowd exploded in cheers and groans as the referee, a goblin whose only job was to yell, "Stop hitting! Him! He's dead!" When things got too rough, hopped down and pulled Smurg off. Smurg wobbled to his feet, grinning. "I win!" Lefty groaned, still seeing stars. Zibs cackled and raked in his winnings, scooping up stolen jewellery, dented coins, and a single dried fish. "Easy money!" Snagg crossed his arms. "How do you always win these bets?" Zibs smirked. "Simple, I only bet when I already know who's going to win." Snagg frowned. "That sounds like cheating." Zibs winked. "Smart cheating." Before the next match could start, a deep drum beat echoed through the cavern. The goblins froze. Snagg's stomach sank. Oh no, it was time for the main event, the champions match. The crowd parted as a goblin twice the size of the others stomped toward the pit, clad in scrap armour and wielding a spiked club. His eyes were wild, his grin full of broken teeth. The undisputed champion of the pit, Gorgo the Bonebreaker. Snagg turned to Zibs. "Who's fighting him?" Zibs shrugged. "Dunno. Ain't been picked yet." The referee cleared his throat. "All right, we need a challenger. Who's feeling lucky?" The crowd immediately took a step back. Snagg smirked. Smart goblins. Then, before he could react, Zibs shoved him forward. Snagg stumbled. The crowd cheered. Snagg's blood ran cold. "What?" he screeched. "I ain't fighting Gorgo." Zibs clapped him on the back. "Come on, Snagg, you could use the exercise." Snagg turned to flee. Too late. The referee grabbed him by the collar and practically flung him into the pit. Thud! Snagg groaned, pushing himself up. The ground was harder than he remembered. He turned, looking up at Gorgo, who was grinning down at him like a wolf about to eat a rabbit. "Hey, pal," Snagg muttered. "We can talk this out, right?" Gorgo roared. Snagg screamed. The bell rang. What follows is an absolute disaster. Snagg, having no formal combat training, runs for his life, dodging wild swings and frantically trying to come up with a plan. The crowd loses their minds, cheering both for Gorgo's brutal swings and Snagg's ridiculous panic-fueled evasions. At one point, Snagg throws dirt in Gorgo's eyes. It works. For about 2 seconds. Then Gorgo picks Snagg up and hurls him across the pit. Snagg lands in a pile of discarded bones, dazed but alive. His mind races. He can't beat Gorgo in a straight fight, but maybe his eyes land on something Gix made, a crude, forgotten bear trap. Snagg grins. He grabs a loose rock, throws it at Gorgo's head, and runs. The champion, enraged, charges. The crowd gasps, and then snap. Gorgo's foot lands directly on the trap. Clang. The metal jaws slam shut. Gorgo roars in pain, stumbling right into a pile of mud and bones. Crash! The entire pit goes silent. Then the referee jumps in, checks Gorgo, and throws his hands up. "Winner! Snagg!" The pit erupts. Snagg, lying on his back, panting, barely believes what just happened. Zibs, now richer than ever, leans over the edge of the pit, grinning. "See? Told you could use the exercise," Snagg groans. He's never coming to the pit fights again. Chapter 6. The Goblin Markets. Snagg was still sore from the disaster that was the pit fight. He had won, sure, but at what cost? Every part of his body ached, his pride was bruised, and worst of all, he was now famous. As he limped through Gritstone Market, goblins kept pointing at him. "There he is, the gob who took down Gorgo. I heard he didn't even use a weapon, just pure rage and goblin instinct." Snagg groaned. This is gonna be a problem. The Market of Wonders and Scams. The Goblin Market was the loudest, filthiest, most chaotic place in all of Gritstone Hold. Stalls of questionable construction leaned at odd angles, covered in stolen tarps, rusty scrap metal, or occasionally old surface world banners taken from unfortunate adventurers. Here, goblins sold everything. Weapons, stolen, rusted, possibly cursed. Potions, made by fizzbricks, so likely explosive. Pets, most of them not actually domesticated. Mushroom brews, some of which doubled as cleaning agents, and magic trinkets, half of them were rocks. Snagg had only one goal, find something to help with the pain. He limped over to a stall run by Granny Baggles, an elderly goblin with a face like a dried mushroom. Her stall was piled high with bottles, sacks of powder, and dried lizard tails. "Ah, Snagg!" she cackled. "I heard you became a champion." Snagg scowled. "I ain't no champion, just a goblin with dumb luck." Granny Baggles nodded. "Luck's a kind of magic too, you know." Snagg rolled his eyes. "Got anything for sore bones?" Granny dug through her pile of junk and pulled out a bottle of green sludge. "This'll fix you right up, made it myself." Snagg frowned. "What's in it?" Granny grinned, revealing too many teeth. "You don't want to know." Snagg sighed. "Fine. How much?" "1 gold." Snagg choked. "1 gold? That's robbery." Granny cackled. "Then go be sore, you big champion baby." Grumbling, Snagg handed over a handful of copper and a button, hoping to distract her with shiny objects. Granny bit the button, then shrugged. "Close enough." The black market corner. Potion in hand, Snagg wandered deeper into the market, passing by the more dangerous stalls. Here the best and worst deals were made. A goblin was trying to sell a haunted shield that whispered insults. Another was trading goblin teeth, not his own. A shifty-looking hobgoblin was selling genuine human swords, which were obviously just broken farming tools. Then Snagg spotted something interesting. A goblin in a tattered cloak stood behind a small unmarked stall. Laid out on the table was a map. Not just any map, an old, yellowed, suspiciously treasure-like map. Snagg narrowed his eyes. "This a scam?" The goblin shook his head. "No scam. This map leads to something real." Snagg crossed his arms. "Yeah? And why ain't you going after it?" The goblin hesitated, then muttered, "Because it's cursed." Snagg stared. "Cursed how?" The goblin's voice dropped to a whisper. "Nobody who's followed it has ever come back." Snagg blinked. Oh, that's a good one. Let me guess, I gotta pay 5 gold to risk my life? The goblin shook his head. 1. Snagg hesitated. That was too cheap, and that made it more suspicious. But Snagg liked knowing things. He liked secrets, and if this map was real, Snagg grinned. Deal. He flipped a gold coin onto the table, snatched up the map, and quickly disappeared into the crowd before he could change his mind. As Snagg made his way back to his bunk, he unrolled the map and studied it under the dim torchlight. It showed tunnels, ones he didn't recognize, and at the very bottom, scrawled in jagged goblin handwriting, were 5 ominous words, "Do not go alone." Snagg stared, then sighed, "Oh, this is going to be stupid." Chapter 7. The Adventurer Problem. Snagg was just starting to feel normal again. His bruises from the pit fight were fading. The goblins were finally talking about something other than his so-called legendary victory, and the war boss hadn't yelled about his missing cricket stash in at least a day. Life in Gritstone Hold was settling back into its usual routine of controlled chaos. And then, "Alarm! Alarm! Surface walkers in the tunnels!" Snagg groaned, mid-mushroom stew, and thunked his head on the table. "Of course," he muttered, just when things were getting peaceful. The surface walker problem. Every so often, some idiot adventurers would get it into their heads that sneaking into a Goblin Stronghold was a smart idea. Sometimes they were young heroes looking for glory. Sometimes they were bored mercenaries looking for loot. And sometimes they were lost, confused, and very, very afraid. The response from Gritstone Hold varied, depending on the situation. If they were well armed, traps, lots of traps. If they looked weak, pranks. If they were really unlucky, the war boss dealt with them personally. This time, Snagg hoped it was just some poor fool who'd wandered in by mistake, because if the war boss got involved, things would get messy. The chase begins. By the time Snagg reached the front gates, a group of goblins had already gathered, eager to watch the commotion. "Where'd they go?" Snagg asked. Zibs, chewing on a stolen carrot, pointed toward a side tunnel. "Couple of 'em snuck in through the old mine shafts. Got spotted by one of the farmers." Snagg sighed. "How many?" 3, maybe 4. Zibs grinned. "But they're clueless. They ain't got a map, they ain't got torches, they ain't got nothing." Snagg rubbed his face. "So, basically, we got a bunch of idiots lost in our tunnels." Zibs nodded. "Yep." Snagg sighed. "All right, let's round 'em up before they step on something dangerous." Adventurer hunting, the Goblin way. The rescue squad, which was really just Snagg, Zibs, and a handful of giggling goblins, moved quickly, tracking the lost adventurers through the winding, poorly lit tunnels. It wasn't hard. The surface walkers had left behind a trail of dumb mistakes. A drop torch. Snagg shook his head. Amateurs. Boot prints in the dirt. One of them had big, clunky armoured feet. A dead giveaway. A half-eaten ration. Someone got hungry mid-escape. Idiots. The goblins followed the trail, whispering excitedly. "Betcha they're knights," one goblin muttered. "Nah, probably just merchants," another guessed. "Maybe they're elves," a third goblin added. Zib snorted. "Elves ain't dumb enough to get lost down here." Snagg smirked. "Yeah, tell that to the last elf who wandered in. Didn't he try to negotiate with a troll?" The goblins cackled at the memory. Then up ahead, voices. The goblins froze. Snagg held up a hand, signalling the others to stay quiet. The adventurers appear. Creeping forward, Snagg peered around a bend in the tunnel. There they were, 3 humans. One wore heavy armour and clutched a sword, clearly the leader. One looked like a rogue, small and jittery, glancing around nervously. One was a wizard, because of course there was a wizard. They were arguing. "We shouldn't have come down here," the rogue hissed. "The tunnel entrance was blocked for a reason." "Relax," the knight grunted. "It's just goblins, we'll be fine." The wizard muttered something under his breath, eyeing the shadows warily. Snagg smirked. "They're scared already." Zibs grinned. "So what's the plan, boss?" Snagg considered. They could just jump out and surround them, or they could lead them deeper into the tunnels. Or, Snagg grinned, they could mess with them first. The goblin prank begins. Snagg turned to his squad. "All right, here's what we're going to do. No weapons, no fighting, just good old goblin nonsense." The goblins nodded excitedly. Then they got to work. Step 1, the noises. A few goblins scattered into side tunnels, making creepy sounds. Whispers, growls. Unnatural. Step 2, the moving shadows. Goblins skittered through the dark, throwing rocks and debris just out of the adventurer's line of sight. Step 3, the fake threat. One goblin threw his voice, mimicking something deep and guttural. "Turn back," the rogue yelped. The knight whipped around, sword raised. "What was that?" The wizard started chanting a spell. Snagg barely held back laughter. This was too easy. The grand finale. The adventurers were on edge, exactly where Snagg wanted them. So to finish things off, he threw a single rock. It clattered loudly against the tunnel wall. "Run!" the rogue screamed. And just like that, they bolted. The knight, the wizard, all of them sprinting back toward the entrance. The goblins exploded into laughter. Zibs wiped a tear from his eye. "That was beautiful," Snagg grinned. "Told you, no fighting needed." The goblins watched the adventurers flee, yelling and tripping over each other, before turning and heading back to the stronghold, completely victorious. Just another day in Gritstone Hold. Chapter 8. Goblin Theatre Night. By the time the adventurers had fully sprinted out of Gritstone Hold's tunnels, likely vowing never to return, the goblins were in high spirits. There was no greater joy than watching overconfident surface walkers trip over their own feet in terror. But Snagg barely had time to enjoy the victory before he was dragged into another stronghold tradition, Goblin Theatre Night. The grand tradition of terrible plays. Every few weeks, the goblins of Gritstone Hold gathered in the Great Hall to witness the finest or worst entertainment their kind could produce. It was a sacred tradition, full of overly dramatic reenactments of historical goblin events, most of them wildly inaccurate. Puppet shows using stolen socks and carved bones. Musical performances featuring off-key flutes, screeching violins, and someone always banging on a pot. And, of course, the legendary Goblin Opera, a performance so emotional that it often ended in a fistfight. Tonight's performance? The Tragedy of Old Boss Gruck, a play about the former war boss of Gritstone Hold, who had not so mysteriously been eaten by a rockworm years ago. It was technically meant to be a serious, dramatic piece, but knowing goblins, it would immediately spiral into disaster. The pre-show chaos. Snagg arrived just as the crowd was settling in, goblins pushing and shoving for the best seats, which didn't exist because every seat was terrible. "Oi, no biting!" a goblin bouncer yelled, dragging two fighters apart. "Where's the snacks?" someone else demanded. In the corner, Zibs was already running a betting pool on whether the play would even finish before turning into an all-out brawl. Snagg slumped into a spot near the back, exhausted but curious. Then the torches dimmed and a goblin in a tattered cloak stomped onto the stage. "Ladies, goblins, and filthy creatures," he bellowed, "we present to you the tragedy of Old Boss Gruck." The crowd cheered, booed, and threw food all at once. Snagg braced himself. This was going to be terrible. Act 1. Immediately a disaster. The first scene opened with a monologue. As a goblin, wearing a too large fake beard, stood centre stage and proclaimed, "I, Boss Gruck, am the mightiest of all. None shall challenge me or—" Crash! A piece of the stage collapsed under his feet, and he immediately vanished into the floor. The crowd howled with laughter. From below, muffled cursing. "Keep going! Keep going!" The next goblin scrambled onto the stage, improvising. And so the war boss ruled with great power. But in the shadows, a betrayer plotted against him. Enter the villain of the play, wearing a crude hood and twirling a fake mustache. "Yes, I shall betray Gruck for no reason at all." Snagg rubbed his temples. "Who wrote this nonsense?" Act 2. The rockworm appears. The tragedy of the play was that Gruck was doomed to be eaten by a rockworm. This was true. But goblins, being goblins, had dramatically exaggerated the story over time. In the play, the rockworm was not a dumb beast. It was a vengeful spirit sent by dark goblin magic to punish Boss Gruck for his greed. Snagg rolled his eyes. "That ain't how it happened," he muttered. Zibs, sitting next to him, shrugged. Facts don't make for a good show." The rockworm then entered the stage, a massive papier-mâché monstrosity, wobbly and unstable, carried by 3 goblins hidden underneath. The crowd went wild. The goblin playing Gruck turned, gasped dramatically, and declared, "Oh no, I am doomed." The rockworm lurched forward. The goblins inside lost control. The entire prop toppled forward, right into the front row of the audience. Goblins screamed, tripped, threw punches, and immediately started looting each other. A torch got knocked over, a chair got thrown, Zibs cackled. "Told you the play wouldn't finish." Snagg sighed, grabbed the nearest half-eaten mushroom skewer, kept watching. The aftermath. By the time the play was over, meaning it had completely collapsed into a food fight and wrestling match, the crowd was delighted. The performance had technically failed, but failure was part of the fun. Snagg dusted himself off, shaking his head. "Goblins really know how to put on a mess, huh?" Zibs grinned. "What do you expect? We ain't elves." The next event, a musical performance involving out-of-tune flutes and war drums, was already setting up. Snagg considered leaving. Then he shrugged. Nah. He grabbed another mushroom skewer, sat back down and settled in for the show. Just another night in Gritstone Hold. Chapter 9. The Tunnels Beneath. Snagg was bored. It was a rare thing, given that life in Gritstone Hold was usually loud, chaotic, and mildly dangerous at all times. But today, nothing was happening. He wasn't on gate duty. There weren't any fights in the pit. Nobody had tried to poison the war boss that he knew of. For once, the stronghold was quiet, and Snagg hated it. "Oi, Snagg!" He looked up from where he was slumped at a table, chewing lazily on a stale mushroom biscuit. Zibs grinned down at him, waving a familiar piece of parchment. "Ya forgot about this, didn't ya?" The map. The one he bought at the market as a joke. The one that led nowhere and was definitely a scam. The one he had tried to forget. "You're still going on about that thing?" Snagg muttered. Zibs shrugged. "I just think it's funny you spent real gold on it and then didn't do nothing with it." Snagg scowled. "Because there ain't nothing to do, it's just some old scribbles." "Then let's go prove it's fake," Zibs said, dropping the map on the table with a satisfying slap. "Come on, what else you got to do today?" Snagg opened his mouth, paused, then cursed, because Zibs was right. He had nothing better to do. "Fine," he grumbled, "but when we find nothing, you shut up about it forever." Zibs grinned. "Deal." The tunnels beneath Gritstone Hold were deep, damp, and smelled like old socks. Nobody used them anymore, not since part of the lower caves collapsed years ago. Most goblins had long since forgotten about them, but every now and then some idiot would wander down and never come back. Snagg and Zibs ducked through a half-collapsed archway, following the crude markings on the map. Immediately, Snagg stepped into something wet. He froze. "Please tell me that's just water." Zibs leaned over, squinting at the puddle. He sniffed, then backed away. "Yup," he said, voice suspiciously casual. "Definitely water." Snagg glared at him. "You're a terrible liar." Zibs shrugged. "Could be worse." Snagg muttered something unkind under his breath and kept walking. The tunnels were narrow and uneven, forcing Snagg and Zibs to crawl at one point to squeeze through an opening. "I hate this," Snagg grumbled. "I hate this so much." Zibs, completely unbothered, hummed a cheerful tune behind him. "You know," Zibs said as they stepped into a wider chamber, "this kind of feels like an adventure." Snagg stopped walking, slowly turned. "We ain't adventurers, Zibs." Yeah, Zibs waved a hand. "I'm just saying, what if we find something cool?" Snagg scoffed. "Like what? More damp socks?" "Could be treasure," Zibs said with a grin. "Could be a waste of time." They continued deeper, past old tunnel supports, past carvings on the walls that looked suspiciously like goblin graffiti, and past a very old, very faded wooden sign that read, "Do not dig here." Snagg glanced at it. "That's comforting." Zibs ignored him and walked ahead. "Come on, map says we're almost there." Snagg sighed and followed. The destination turned out to be a dead end, a collapsed tunnel, completely blocked off by rock, dirt, and what might have once been support beams. Zibs stared at it. "Snagg." "Ha!" Snagg threw up his arms. "Told ya! Nothing here!" Just a big pile of disappointment. Zibs pouted. "Well, maybe if we dug a little, or checked around—" "No!" Zibs kicked a loose rock in frustration. It clattered loudly. Then something soft and squishy fell from the ceiling. Both goblins froze. A fat, white cave spider plopped onto the floor between them, its many legs twitching. Snagg stared. Zibs stared. The spider stared back. "Run," Zibs whispered. Snagg nodded slowly, and then they ran. By the time they stumbled back into Gritstone Hold, panting and covered in cobwebs, Snagg was done with maps. He slammed it onto the first table he saw and marched away. Zibs picked it up, examined it, and then, without hesitation, held it up toward a passing goblin. "Oi, want to buy a valuable map?" The goblin took one look at it, snorted, and kept walking. Zibs sighed and dropped it back onto the table. No respect for history. Snagg sat down, rubbing his face. "That was stupid." "Yup," Zibs agreed, grinning. "But we ain't dead, so I call it a success." Snagg grumbled something, reaching for a plate of half-eaten mushroom stew. At the far end of the stronghold, some goblins were brawling over an old boot. The war boss was yelling about something stupid, and somewhere in the tunnels a very confused cave spider was probably still wondering what happened. Snagg sighed, content. Just another day in Gritstone Hold. Chapter 10. Night in Gritstone Hold was never quiet. Even as most goblins settled into their sleep piles, the stronghold still buzzed with life. Somewhere, a group of goblins argued over loot. A trader tried to convince someone that a rock was a legendary artifact, and someone, somewhere, was absolutely up to no good. Snagg was too tired to care. After a long day of running from spiders, proving Zibs wrong, and avoiding any more stupid adventures, all he wanted to do was sit down, eat his stew, and let the stronghold carry on around him. Across the hall, Zibs was still up to something. Snagg squinted as he saw his friend huddled with a group of younger goblins, the now completely useless map held high like some kind of sacred relic. "Deep in the tunnels," Zibs whispered dramatically, "we found something horrible, something so dangerous we barely escaped with our lives." The young goblins gasped. "Zibs," he called, voice muffled through a mouthful of stew, "quit filling their heads with nonsense." "I ain't," Zibs shot back. "I'm just telling the truth, in a dramatic way." Snagg rolled his eyes. "Yeah? And how come I don't remember no horrible monster chasing us?" Zibs grinned. "You was running too fast to see it." The young goblins looked at each other, eyes wide. Snagg threw a piece of stale bread at Zibs's head. The stronghold began to settle down, the last few goblins drifting off to sleep. Snagg stretched, settling against the wall, content to finally get some rest. Then a distant howl echoed through the tunnels. Snaggoblins stiffened. "What was that?" one of the younger goblins whispered. Another nervously adjusted his tunic. "Was that a cave ghost?" Zibs immediately leaned in, eyes wide. "Sounds like old boss Gruck, back for revenge." The goblins yelped and scattered, sprinting off to their bunks. Snagg sighed. "You really gotta stop doing that." Zibs shrugged. Builds character." Snagg shook his head. He closed his eyes, finally ready to sleep. And then, crash! A goblin fell straight through the ceiling, landing hard on the stone floor. Snagg's eyes snapped open as the dust settled, revealing a scrawny goblin, blinking in shock, covered in dirt and cobwebs. From somewhere deep in the tunnels, the howling stopped. The room went silent. Then, the fallen goblin sucked in a breath and yelled, "I found a secret tunnel." Silence. Then, from across the stronghold, the furious voice of Warboss Cruz roared, "Who let that thing back in here?" Snagg slowly sat up, staring at the twitching goblin on the ground. His eye twitched. His head ached. He exhaled slowly. I ain't dealing with this." And with that he rolled over, pulled a ragged blanket over his head, and pretended to be asleep. Just another night in Gritstone Hold. The end. Thank you for listening to this audiobook. We hope you enjoyed the journey and look forward to sharing more adventures with you in the future.